Hey, Chris Salvaterra here to talk about basic movie structure. I say movie structure, not script structure, because movie, of course, implies script. You can't make a movie without a script. I guess you could, but it would suck. I use the term movie structure because it's something that's not only important for a screenwriter to understand, it's vital for an executive, a producer, a director, pretty much anyone involved on the creative side of movie making. Now, there are many resources online for screenwriters and for theories about screenplays and film, and there have been many books written by very smart, very knowledgeable, studied people on the subject. I highly recommend any one of these books you see on the screen. Now, in my opinion, there's no element of script writing or script reading or movie storytelling that is more important to understand than basic film structure. A lot of story problems can be worked through early on by identifying a structure appropriate for the story you're telling. And the good news is that, in my experience, it's not some magical quality that you're either born with or not. It's a skill that's learned through study and repetition. A little then and now, when I was starting out back in the 90s, I had to get a job at an agency to have access to a wide array of scripts. And I had to go to the movie theater to see a movie. I couldn't afford a VCR at the time. And I would check my watch every so often to study a movie's structure, which made for some awkward dates. I knew my wife and I were destined to be together when we were in a movie together. And I checked my watch, and she said, "Do you have somewhere to be?" When I was a junior executive doing notes, I made it a habit to watch analogous movies and literally write down the structure, which means I had journals that made me look like John Doe from Seven. Also file that under awkward dates, but I learned a lot about structure. Another piece of good news is that, in my opinion, we're living in a golden age of film research. Now, virtually everything is at one's fingertips. One can watch movies instantly on the computer and have the time code right there, right at the bottom of the screen, which is incredibly helpful for learning structure, and I wish I had when I was sort of starting out. And one can download pretty much any script on PDF. Everyone in Hollywood has now ditched their script bags for iPads. And in my opinion, it's a gold mine, and you're crazy if you don't take advantage of it. By take advantage of it, I mean study, 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 read, 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 watch, watch, watch. There's no replacement for time and work, but the good news is that studying for us means watching movies, which is pretty cool. There are many different theories as to film structure, and they're all valid to the extent that they're helpful to you. I want to focus on the two theories slash concepts that have been most helpful to me: the traditional three-act structure and what's called the hero's journey. The good news is that these two theories are generally not in opposition to one another. In fact, they can work quite well together, and we will see how. Okay, most people know about the three-act dramatic structure, but here's a quick refresher. It's a common paradigm in the history of narrative storytelling. Essentially, dramatic structure can be boiled down to setup, conflict, and resolution. The most memorable, if ridiculously simplistic way I've heard it as applied to film is that in Act 1 you get your hero up a tree, in Act 2 you throw rocks at him, and in Act 3 you get him down. I wish I could remember where I heard that. Maybe it was a Dr. Seuss book, but I literally read dozens of books about screenwriting when I first came out here. Of course, it's much more complicated than that, and the additional challenge with the three-act film structure is that you have a finite amount of time in which to tell a story, as opposed to, say, a novel in which you have fewer parameters with regard to length. So let's look at the structure of film and some rules to keep in mind. Caveat to remember: despite some script theorists sounding quite categorical in their approach, in my experience, no script theory works for every single script or movie. But the three-act structure is one that most, if not all, scripts adhere to. Now, obviously, there are movies of different length, and a 2.5 or 3 hour movie is going to have a different structure or sort of time breaks than an hour and a half or 2 hour movie. But it's helpful to start to think of movies not in hours but in minutes, because that's where the structure comes into play. You've probably heard that the general adage for the film industry is that one script page equals 1 minute of movie. So if a script is 120 pages, that's 120 minutes, which is 2 hours. Now, a quick note, in general, despite the fact that many movies in theaters are that length, if you're writing a screenplay that's 120 pages, it's too freaking long. And trust me, whoever's reading your script is going to see the page length and go, it's too freaking long. So let's break down the acts. Act 1 is generally considered to be the first 30 minutes of the film. During the first act, there's something called the inciting incident that sets the story in motion. At the end of the first act, there's a plot twist or turn that sends the characters into the central conflict of the story. Act 2 maximizes the conflict that's set up in Act 1, and Act 3, let's jump to Act 3 real quick. Act 3 resolves the conflict, gets the hero out of the tree, if you will. Now, let's focus on Act 2, because in my experience, it's by far the most difficult to write or execute. It's the longest of the acts, and there's danger to it drifting or feeling what we call episodic, simply going from one scene to the next with no real sense of momentum or dramatic build. Now, it's for this reason that I'm a huge proponent of the turn at the middle of Act 2. And I'll have examples in a minute. It's an incredibly helpful boost, sort of a performance-enhancing drug, the thing that A-Rod denies doing. And if one can figure out a strong turn at or around page/minute 50, it will be a revelation to your storytelling and help to shape the movie. Now let's look at a few examples. All of these examples are streamable on Netflix, so you can check them out yourself if you want. In general, with these videos about storytelling, I'll try to use movies that are streamable so you can toggle back and forth if you like. Now, I happened to be watching The Apartment the other day because I could, and it's awesome. Billy Wilder was both a writer and a director, and clearly devoted to dramatic structure. It's amazing how precise both the Act 1 and mid-Act 2 turns are in The Apartment. I'm sure you remember the story, but a quick refresher. It's about C.C. Baxter, played by Jack Lemmon, who lets the married men at his company, every one of whom seems like a complete douchebag, use his apartment for trysts. He has designs on the woman who operates the elevator, whose name is Fran, played by Shirley MacLaine. And as a result of his practice of lending out his apartment, he draws the attention of the big boss, Sheldrake, played by Fred McMurray, and the big boss wants to take advantage of it. The end of Act 1, in which Cece talks to Sheldrake in his office and gives him the key to said apartment, is exactly in minute 30. It's pretty uncanny. So, Cece has lent his boss the key, and in the sequence that follows, Cece plans on meeting Fran for a date, but Fran stands him up because she's with Sheldrake. But Cece does not know that, and not until literally minute 50, in which Cece sees, that's hard to say, that Fran has the broken makeup mirror he found left behind in his apartment. So in the middle of Act 2, this guy realizes, holy shit, the girl I love is my boss's mistress. How's that for an injection of drama? Talk about conflict. Now the end of Act 2 is around minute 70, when he realizes that Fran, whom he found in his apartment, has tried to commit suicide. The second half of the movie is slightly more amorphous structurally, given that most of it takes place in Cece's apartment as he nurses Fran back to health. But the end of Act 1 and middle of Act 2 are textbook structural timing. Now, let's go to a movie that's a little more poppy and recent, just so you don't think of this dramatic structure as only applying to the classics. Men in Black, although some people might think of this as a classic. The first one, which is 98 minutes long, which almost an hour and 40 minutes. Jay, played by Will Smith, becomes an official agent at the end of Act 1 and is introduced to / trained in the world of Men in Black. Meanwhile, there's a subplot in which an alien takes a human form. He's looking for a galaxy. We're not really sure why, except there's another alien race that really doesn't want him to have it. Essentially, that's a device called the MacGuffin. It's a plot device. Basically, it's the thingy that everybody wants. It doesn't particularly matter what it is, so long as everyone in the movie wants it or doesn't want other people to have it. By the middle of Act 2, agents J and K realize that the alien that crash landed is a bug, which sounds really mild to us, but is really bad news for the people in the movie. The agents begin to investigate and get closer to finding the bug, while the bug tries to find the galaxy. At the precise moment that Jay realizes the galaxy is here, as in on Earth, and it's around the neck of the cat, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it actually works pretty well. The fetching mortician or scientist or whatever she is who has the cat realizes the same thing, and the alien bug shows up at the morgue. So the end of Act 2, around minutes 68 to 70, is a very effective plot convergence in which the bug now has the galaxy and the men in black must stop him. Now, quick detail on the structure of Men in Black. No one's fighting for the screenplay to be named best ever, but it has a very solid, effective structure for its genre, with parallel plots that start to head towards one another at the middle of Act 2, and then meet at the end of Act 2 with an inevitable explosion, in a good way, in Act 3. Now for a more recent movie that also happens to have been a giant hit and generated, I think, 27 sequels, something like that. The Hunger Games doesn't necessarily have that to-the-minute structure that Men in Black has, probably because it was adapted from a book, and in my experience, book adaptations can be very challenging structurally. At 142 minutes, that's 2 hours and 22 minutes. It's longer than one might expect, but that's also probably due to its origins as a book series. I'm assuming that everybody knows the setup of the Hunger Games, but here's a quick recap. Katniss Everdeen's sister gets named to the Hunger Games. Katniss steps in to take her place. Suddenly she finds herself thrust into this strange world, which more on that when we get to the hero's journey. The end of Act 1 is when the tributes, including Katniss, are introduced for the first time in a grand parade with hundreds of thousands of people, in which Katniss wears a dress of fire. Early in Act 2, her initiation kicks into high gear, and in my opinion, the middle of Act 2 is around 60 minutes in when the games officially begin. And the end of Act 2 is arguably around minute 100, when Katniss's survival begins to spark riots and the higher-ups are forced to change the rules of the game. As I said, the Hunger Games is longer, so the acts are arguably more spaced out, and nothing is written in exact, precise stone with regard to film structure. These principles are merely a guide or a compass of sorts. Okay, so we've covered the three-act film structure pretty well, with hopefully proper emphasis on the importance of the middle of Act 2. Now on to the next structural theory that has been very helpful to me and many others in the film business. Joseph Campbell, who died in 1987, was a famous scholar of myth, the stories that are told around the world throughout cultures and history. He espoused the concept of monomyth, which is the idea that all myths are a variation on a single story. He was a professor at Sarah Lawrence for 38 years and wrote numerous books. His landmark, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, was read by George Lucas when he was writing Star Wars, and Lucas has given much credit to his narrative mentor, though apparently no money. Joseph Campbell was also featured in a PBS series in the 80s with Bob Moyer that has since become quite well known, called The Power of Myth. You can see a lot, if not all of it, on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. With George Lucas being arguably the first filmmaker to publicly and vocally acknowledge the influence of the hero's journey, Hollywood has become devoted to the principles, and of course poured them into the three-act format. The Matrix follows the formula to the letter to awesome, mind-blowing effect. There's actually quite a bit of content on YouTube about the hero's journey in The Matrix, as well as a lot of other movies. In the 90s, a guy named Christopher Vogler wrote a memo called A Practical Guide to the Hero of a Thousand Faces, and that was widely distributed in Hollywood. He became a story consultant and I believe a teacher, and then wrote a book called The Writer's Journey. And one of his students, Stuart Wojtyla, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, took his Vogler's principles further and wrote Myth and the Movies, which I've found to be a great reference guide for movies in many genres that use elements of the hero's journey. I've had that book for I would say 12, 13 years, and refer to it quite often. So, what the hell is the hero's journey? And here's a snapshot. The hero's journey is characterized by a man or woman who ventures from an ordinary to a special world, experiences great difficulty and suffering, faces battles and tests along the way, and then returns home with gifts slash powers slash keys to existence that will help set society free. There are archetypes or characters who are common to this kind of story. The hero, of course, the mentor, the threshold guardian who tests, the herald who warns and challenges, the shapeshifter who questions and deceives, the shadow who destroys, the trickster who disrupts. Story stages as part of the hero's journey that are common to this: the scene in the ordinary world where we meet the hero, the call to adventure, the refusal of the call in which the hero faces doubts, meeting the mentor, crossing the threshold from the ordinary to the special world, tests slash allies and enemies, approaching the inmost cave or the hero facing his or her deepest fears, the ordeal, the reward, the road back, the resurrection, and return with the elixir or knowledge. Now, the hero's journey is a rabbit hole that we can go down and never come out of, so you can dive in as deep as you want. But real quick, if you look at the movies we reviewed as part of the 3-act structure, Men in Black and The Hunger Games fit many aspects of the hero's journey. So let's look at Men in Black first. Will Smith is a cop, he's a hero in the ordinary world, who meets Tommy Lee Jones, the mentor, and gets initiated into the Men in Black. He's crossing the threshold into the special world, where he undergoes tests, he confronts inmost fears, in this case Armageddon, the end of the world, and returns with the elixir, which in his case is the knowledge of the world of aliens in our world and the powers to navigate it. Over to the Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen gets plucked from her district, ordinary world, to compete in the Hunger Games, the special world. Once she crosses the threshold, there is no going back. She either wins or dies, or at least initially, as she understands it. She meets the mentor, Woody Harrelson. There's also Lenny Kravitz. Many allies and enemies. She survives and returns home to the ordinary world forever changed. Of course, this version is a bit darker because she has confronted death, and though she survived, she has cheated the authorities. But she's done it to represent and protect those who are back home. So the takeaways from this epic treatise. The two film story structure theories that we covered. 3-act structure. Act 1 generally minutes 1 through 30. Act 2 generally minutes 30 through 80. Act 3 generally minutes 80 to 110, give or take. Act 2 is the hardest to understand and execute, often falling prey to sag. Vital to keep in mind is the middle of Act 2, around minute 50, in which there's a turn that jacks us towards the end of Act 2. The hero's journey, espoused by Joseph Campbell, a scholar of myth stories and embraced by Hollywood, elements include the hero going from the ordinary world to the special world, facing allies, enemies, and tests, confronting inmost fears, and returning with knowledge and skill, the elixir, that will help society. If you're working on a story, whether you're writing a script or developing one or thinking about writing or developing one, ask yourself what the 3-act structure would be and what the middle of Act 2 would be. And additionally, ask yourself if there are elements in your idea of the hero's journey, or could there be, because that's a very helpful kind of narrative structure to consider. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and look for more.